If we haven't met, my name's Byron. You'll normally see me hidden just by the drum kit behind or running around doing something that I've decided to help out with. But it's a real pleasure to be able to bring you some thoughts and just some ideas on today's passage. And let me preface it with this. This is not some information for you to just take in and just take straight to heart. I would love for you to start a discussion from this. Anything I say that doesn't quite sit right with you, that you want to question further, that you actually are really going to wrestle with, that's okay. And I really recommend and suggest, find someone trusted, find someone in an orange lanyard if you want to do that here, and have those discussions. Don't just take it at face value, explore, search, dig. I should put Tri Alpha on the end of that, but we've already done that announcement. And so you join us this afternoon, in the middle of a series that we're going through as a church, exploring the book of Exodus and looking at how the story of the Israelites, of Moses and Aaron, can inform and inspire our daily walk with Jesus today. And it's really fitting that Christopher, you read the second part of our passage, because Christopher gave us our last segment of this series where he discussed and looked at how God uses what God has placed in Moses and Aaron's hands to do his work. And we saw a beautiful example of this. Yesterday, we had a Reset Women's Conference where in the morning session, a word was given about releasing new ministries. And we just saw this church filled with 250 women all on fire for God, and being prayed that the things in their hands would be used to glorify him. It was just wonderful. And so let me start with posing a question. What is the best meal you've ever been invited to? Maybe it was a wedding breakfast. I'm planning a wedding at the moment, and the discussions around the breakfast have been long and dull and really exciting. Don't let my fiance hear that. She feels the same. Maybe it was a really, really lovely meal with some really close friends. Or maybe it was a takeaway after a day at a conference. But I'd just love for you to think about that, because we never, being invited to a meal is a really special thing. I love food, and I love being hosted, and I love hosting. And if it was up to me, the sixth love language would be food of any way, shape, or form. Thanks be to God. But yeah, so think about the best meal that you've been invited to, because one of the things we'll be looking at is actually God invites two groups of people, the Israelites and us, to a certain special meal. And the meals that you've been to, they may have been joyous with memories, but these meals we discuss today have a real implication for our life, both today and in the years and the centuries to come. But before we go on to food, because that's where I'd want to go, that's the most exciting bit, I think there's some real context. And in the verse we've had today, there are some really heavy things. We talk about plagues and the death of a firstborn. And I just want to give a bit of context, a bit of time, a bit of space to that. So in this passage, we have had 9 plagues that have been inflicted upon Egypt. And we see that because of a Pharaoh who decides to take God head first and won't let the Israelites go. And I'm sure many of you will know the story, but to very, very quickly summarize it, Moses hears from God, goes to Pharaoh, asks him to let his people go, to ask to let God's people go. Pharaoh says no. Moses comes back, asks to let my people go. Pharaoh says no. Moses comes back and asks, let my people go. Pharaoh says, yes, but no. And then we come back and Moses comes back and asks again. And we have this, to this point in the passage today, we've had 10 questions from Moses pleading and asking Pharaoh to let his people go. And with that, we've had 10 questions, we've had 10 plagues, we've had 10 reactions, and we've had 10 glances and chances of seeing God's grace work in Pharaoh's life. But we know that because Pharaoh's heart was hardened, that we know that this is going to be escalated. It's going to get to a point, as we have today, where God has to do something drastic. And this is really difficult, and I've been wrestling with this a little bit this week, is that how can we worship and trust a God who has killed a load of firstborns? And that doesn't just mean babies and goats and lambs and ponies. I can't think of any other names for baby animals or people. But this would have affected a whole range of people and ages and groups and demographics. And we know that it would have affected Pharaoh personally, which is why it's so important that this plague has to happen. We see that there is not lovely, that's really the wrong word. There is an incredible mirror image of the attack that Pharaoh makes on the Hebrews is reciprocated after 10 chances of mercy. Let me just really, really hone that in, that this is not God going tit for tat with Pharaoh. This is God proving that actually I am God. That Pharaoh in Egyptian culture would have been seen as God on earth. But God, Yahweh, the God that we worship today, is proving I am bigger than this God. And so because of that, we are led, and the Israelites are invited to take part in a Passover meal. And if you ask me, it sounds quite nice. I like a bit of roast lamb, and I like some unleavened bread. I was in Willow earlier for lunch, and they do lamb and flatbread. And I thought, do I be that preacher that eats the meal I'm preaching on before I come in? I didn't. I had chicken and gnocchi. It was lovely. Highly recommend it if you're ever looking for a date night, date lunch, or just a quick grab, a quick bite. But God, in his kindness, gives Moses this really key instructions, really easy instructions of find a lamb spotless. We'll come on to that later. It must be a year old. Find it on the 10th day of the first month of the year. Look after it for 4 days, and then roast it with bitter herbs and serve it with unleavened bread. And what I love is a small detail of if your household is too small, then invite your friends to come and eat with you. Invite your neighbors to come round. And what a beautiful relational God to ask us to invite people around to share a meal. And we have the privilege of knowing what's coming next. When the Israelites were preparing for this, they wouldn't have known that the very next day they would be fleeing from Egypt. They would have known at some point, but maybe not the next day. And so we look at the Passover meal and we see that there's lamb, there's bread, there's community, and there's one more instruction that's really, really key and important for this preach this evening. The Israelites are told to take the blood of the lamb and to spread it over the doorway, and to do that with hyssop to cover the doorframe in blood. And this would be a sign to the Lord that anyone in this house, in that property, is safe, that death has no right to take anything on their life at that moment, that when the Lord is coming over, that they're safe. And it is the sign of the blood that does that. Again, we'll come on to that later on. And so this meal is special. This meal is important. This meal is full of symbolism. This meal is filled with really yummy lamb. But it's also a meal that was for the Israelites. If you look around, we're not in Israel. And we're not, I hope, on the brink of coming out of 400 years of slavery. But we are invited to a different meal. And as I was asking the Lord, what should I talk about today? That was the key thing. That the Passover meal was for a certain people in a certain context, in a certain time. And we can read about it today and we can reflect on it. And it's really important that we do, because it demonstrates the power of the God that we worship. But we're invited to a different meal. We're invited to a meal by Jesus where we're invited to take bread, to take wine as a symbolism of a new covenant that we can come into, a new safety. And that this meal is for everyone. There is no one that is isolated from this. There's no one that can be counted out of this meal of communion, which is why it's so special that after this, we're going to share communion as a family, as a church. And maybe, well, let's go over what communion is first and foremost. Communion is an act of worship that we get to perform, that we get to partake in. It's one that Jesus gives to his disciples at a Passover meal the night before the crucifixion. It's that, not process, but the night before, and he shares with his disciples and says, take this wine. This is to be my blood, which washes away the sin, that forgives sins. And take this bread. This is my body broken for you. And we'll unpack that a little bit. But I think for some of us here, and I definitely used to struggle with communion, because I grew up in a church where communion wasn't shared. It wasn't a thing. So when I started a separate church, and they did take communion, I was kind of presented with this new thing that I could do. Oh, great, communion. I can take this. I've heard about this. How exciting. And so I joined the queue, and I saw that the people in front of me were holding out their hand in a kind of cup shape, and I went, okay, I should probably do this. So I stand there and I'd kind of, does this look right? And I'd look across the other side of the church, and I'd take a step forward, and I got in front of the bread. And I was refused. I was not turned away. I can't actually remember what happened, but I didn't receive communion that day. And conveniently, for the next, I don't know how long, whenever communion was served, I conveniently had to go to the toilet. And I would hide out for about 15 minutes, knowing that if I stayed there, I wouldn't have to face the rejection of that church. I wouldn't have to risk being turned away. But Jesus doesn't turn you away from this meal. Jesus invites us and says, if you love me, if you want to love me, come and have this wine, because this wine represents what I've done for you, that I've taken your sin onto my back. Come and have this bread. This bread represents my body. You can touch bread. You can see that the bread can interact with the ground that we walk on, just as we we know that Jesus walked on the earth that we are. And I don't know if anyone here struggles with communion, but if you do, that's okay. And if you don't, that's okay too. I'm really happy and I'm really glad that you can easily come and access an act of worship. And we're going to have a space of prayer after communion. I'd really encourage you to come and receive prayer for that, because we'd love to just pray for you anyway. This meal that we're invited to is open to everyone, and Jesus doesn't turn away. And so I wanted to take a quick minute to just look at what this wine that we talk about, what does it actually do? Because it's really easy to say, the wine that washes away, the blood that washes away the sins of our hearts. What does that actually mean? What are we doing when we partake in this worship? And then we'll do the same with the bread. And I'm going to throw out some scriptures. I'm very sorry. I haven't made slides. But if you're a note taker or you're not, I have them all written down. Just come and take a photo of this sheet of paper or ask, and I would love for you to just go away and read them. Check out what I'm saying. Let it wash over you yourself. But when we take the wine, when we're reminded of what Jesus' blood has done for us, we can be assured that before God, it justifies us. And we're told this in Romans chapter 5, verse 9. We're told that this blood that was given freely for us redeems and forgives us. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 7. Can you see where this is going? That this blood cleanses us of our sin. 1 John 1, verse 7. That this blood has overcome and will overcome evil. Revelation chapter 12, verse 11. That through this blood, we can come to the throne of God. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 13. That this blood demonstrates God's righteousness by forgiving us. That through the act of us coming to God, we can just show how good God is. Romans 3, verses 24 to 25. That this blood will not run dry. This blood cannot be taken back. This blood and this covenant that we enter when we take communion, it lasts forever. 1 Peter 1, verses 18 to 29. And finally, and there's so much more, but these are just some scriptures that I've picked out for us today. This blood washes us clean again, but it honors us. It talks in Revelation chapter 1, verses 5 about how we are made priests and kings in the eyes of God. And when we drink this wine, or non-alcoholic wine, as we will later, I want to challenge you and encourage you. Do you believe that this is what the wine resembles to you? Have you fallen into this rhythm of communion? It's great. This is a really lovely thing to do. Will you let Jesus do these things for you through the wine? And maybe you've had that before. Maybe you can remember your first experience where communion became so real to you. Bring that back to memory now. Think on it. Or if you've not, when you come to receive communion later, think on these scriptures. I'll leave this here for you to see. Maybe take some time and read them. See just what God wants to say to you about communion. Because this blood, this wine that's shared at the communion meal is for everyone. And just like the blood that was spread on the doorposts for the Passover meal, that meant that anyone inside this area was safe. If we said the door was here, we've painted over, I could step through, and if I was in this bit, I'd be safe. But this new covenant, this new blood that is poured for us, it puts a seal over our hearts that when death comes at the end, it will have no place in our hearts because Jesus has claimed that as his own. And so let's do the same thing for the bread. That when we take this bread, we remember the brutal, hurtful way that Jesus walked the earth, that he was treated. The fact that he could walk the earth, the fact that we have a God that not only sits in the high places and looks over us, but he comes and sits in the low places with those that you'd never expect him to be with. That he comes and sits with us, that he has a body, that he's understood what it means to be human. He's understood what it means to see health scares, to know what sand between your toes feels like. The bread is a reminder that we don't have a God that is far away looking over, but we have a God who comes close and loves to. So this bread reminds us that we can enter into a new consecrated way of life. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19 to 20. Consecrated means made holy, means made really, really special to God. This bread is a reminder that we are being interceded for, that Jesus now, the bread that we take, Jesus is sat at the right-hand side of the Father interceding for us, that Jesus is praying for you. He's invited you to this meal, and he's gone, there you go, have that. That's really lovely. And now I'm going to pray for you. And one of the greatest joys of being invited to someone's home, especially if they're Christian, is spending time in prayer with them. I love seeing how people always have their really special prayer chair at home. It's always really interesting to see what it is. That's a complete side note. This bread that we take means that we can be free from the law, that when we come to Christ, we're called to love one another as we love ourselves. But more importantly than that, we're called to love God with our heart, body, soul, mind, and strength. That's the law that Jesus cares about. What's the condition of your heart, not the condition of your actions? This bread reminds us that by Jesus' inflictions and pain, we are healed. That when he takes to the cross, he takes our sin on his back and allows us to be healed, to be reconciled to the Father. That this bread I've not been given any of the Bible notes. I'm really sorry. Just come and read it. That's the way to do it. That through this bread, we are given eternal life. That we'll have the seal on our hearts that death has no place with us anymore. And that we will be eternally satisfied. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. That we can constantly come back to him. We can constantly walk with him and find satisfaction and supplement in walking with him. That doesn't always mean that it will be a really lovely meal. It doesn't always mean that it will be great, but it means that we can walk knowing that Jesus is with us eternally. So, Telford Minster, let me ask you, will you come to this meal? Will you sit at the table that's been prepared for us? Will you, in the presence of your enemies, of your friends, of your Savior, sit at that prepared table? Another sense I had, and again, this might just be me working through some things, was that some people really struggle when we talk about this idea of Jesus dying for us, because it doesn't bring love, but you feel like you have to love Jesus because of a guilt that it brings. That if Jesus has done this for me, then I must feel this because everyone else in the room feels this. But Luke, if you could pop up Hebrews 12, verse 2 for me. Notice that the word in bold is joy. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, where he intercedes for us. For the joy. We're not invited to a meal out of obligation. And if you have a space of your own and you love to host, do you invite people that you don't like? To take time to prepare, to cook, to choose the drink, to choose the candle scent that you're going to put on the table, to place cutlery out. That's an act of love, of preparing a place. And Jesus invites you to come and sit at a table prepared with love. Because he would much rather take the punishment of us getting it wrong than risk not having a relationship with us. That he would rather take that punishment, take the shame, the pain, the mocking, the beating, for the joy of knowing you, rather than seeing us go through it. And as we kind of end and reflect on that, I'd love to invite you to stand, if you're able. I realise this has been quite heavy in some ways. but I would love to focus on that word joy, that Jesus hasn't done this out of obligation, but it's his joy to see you come to know him. And I wonder if you'll take him up on that offer of an eternal meal prepared for us out of love, for love.